Re-grab a seat, extend a warm welcome. And if you are really new in the last week or two, today we are concluding a focus that we've had over the last couple weeks on navigating seasons of change, because life will bring those seasons and it's important, but particularly because we recognize that we as a community are in a seasons of change. As was noted, we have this coming Saturday, this final landing into this celebration of the 50 years, and incredible opportunity to honor, and a very timely one, to honor those while we still can, that were really part of that formative foundation of which we enjoy and live in, but also because it culminates in the installation of Josh Shaw as the next lead pastor of this church. We can applaud. And so it brings that this opportunity of transitioning to where Josh will be leading that next season, that new season. And so to me today is the last time of standing here as lead pastor of a story that began, and I realized looking back, in 1985, I began attending. God kind of really called me to make a transition here. I was 24 years old. And 2 years later, I joined the staff. And about 4 years later, ended up leading the church since 1991, which was like 33 years ago. So all to say that I am so looking forward to, thank you, but like, I haven't known what a weekend is for a long time. So there's lots of joy to be had, but recognizing that there's this enormous transition that we're kind of landing into and going through together. And I just want to say, I could spend the whole morning and wish that it was appropriate to have done so. I don't think it is, to share with you that if you knew what was really in my heart, like a Joel does and others, for the next season, you would understand why I am so genuinely excited for Josh and Brianne to be leading this. If you knew how much God had actually been profoundly a part of the process, it would really stir you. And I don't want to get lost in all of those elements in and of themselves, but just to say God has so prepared this season of change. And I want to deeply reaffirm, as we've kind of been in this series and talking about changes, what Josh said so beautifully and brilliantly last week as he was bringing forth that message. And I don't mean the part about guys over 50 shouldn't wear skinny jeans. I get that part, and I canceled my order this week after he said that. But the part, the core of what he said is that God is in all of it, and part of our way of thinking about life is to realize that God is the God of what was, what is, and what is to come. And if we really grasp that and live into that, it means that we can honor the past and grasp it and realize that we carry that forward in so many ways. And we see God is wanting that, and what he began, he continues in ways. John Wimber, the kind of founder of the larger vineyard movement, when he came to the end of his time, he continually poured out into some of us, take the best and go. Take what is kind of part of that DNA, these core things that God has sown and entrusted uniquely to the vineyard movement, but go forward into what is new. So it is honoring the past, but it is also anticipating what is to come. And as Josh said, and it struck me so well, we need to come together and be those who dream of what God still has. Really join in, like dreaming, not just like continue, but dreaming and anticipating. So we honor the past, we anticipate, but we embrace that God is in the present, meaning in the midst of even today, right now, here in this room is God. And he's wanting to constantly speak and pull and nudge, and we've known that and felt it, but it's being present ourselves into all that he is doing. And so today I want to speak to the unique role of which this transition is now at hand about, which is that of pastor, and particularly that of the lead pastor role. But I also don't want anyone to miss the fact that you often may not be as aware of just that there is a whole team of people who, in a way, from God's point of view, are overseers and are part of that overseeing. There is Joel of over 22 years pastoring here. There is Ron, incredible, over 10 years. You've got Josh Call and his life, but you have Brody. On the eldership, you have Brody, and you have Emily, and you have Bob, and you don't see them. But these are people who, when they assume that role, you need to know they did it saying, I'm willing to take responsibility to oversee the spiritual well-being of this community, and they take it seriously. So there is this broader oversight. But what we understand is that the lead pastor is kind of a first among equals. In other words, they are set apart with the ultimate responsibility of that spiritual leadership. And so in that way, we focus on that. And we come to a text this morning that I want to bring before us, and it comes from the biblical book of Hebrews. Kind of a strange name for a book, like I kind of get the city ones and Corinth and all, but Hebrews was deemed to be probably called that book or got that name because it seems to speak to the Hebrew followers of Jesus, which means the Jewish followers of Jesus, or at least it speaks into dynamics there unfolding, and that is because they were challenged as to how do we live? This is hard. How do we navigate this world living and following the way of Jesus when it's hard? And so what the writer does so beautifully is speak and grasp the fact that everything God had planned is now being fulfilled, the supremacy of Christ, because everything about priesthood, for instance, that the people had known was fulfilled in Jesus. He is now that priest that fulfilled all of the priests. Everything that had been known in sacrificial systems of religion and their ways was fulfilled in him. He is the finality of all these things. And he is the one that fulfills it and the one in whose life we lead. And so it culminates towards the end, gets to what we designate the last chapter, chapter 13, into one of the most beautiful summations of how we should live that I have ever known. And I would encourage you, if you don't know what else you want to do this week, just read through the whole of chapter 13. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lead us to one primary verse, though, that's about the role of pastor, and we'll come there. But I'll lead us there by just a few other statements that you will find in this. So you can follow with me as we look at a few portions of this chapter and then land in this verse. Starting in verse 1, it says, keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. Continue to remember those mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. So he's saying if you want to know how to live, take on the spirit of Jesus that loves other people, that has hospitality, that makes space for people who don't yet know him. Make space for them, and also have empathy. Like really take people in. This is the beauty of what God did for us, comes into the world to do, so live that way. Then he says, remember your leaders in verse 7, who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So do not be carried away by all kinds of strange teachings. There was a lot of religious ideas that made their way back in, and he's saying, keep those away. That is part of what the leader does. It's connecting it to that. And then he says, through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that what? Openly profess his name. Exactly what Brianne led us in this morning, lifting up his name and professing it and living in that reality. And do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. It's all of what we seek to be about. But he comes to this verse 17, which is what I want to bring us to and engage this morning. He says, have confidence in your leaders and submit to their authority because they keep watch over you as those who must give an account. Do this so that their work will be a joy, not a burden, for what would that be of a benefit to you? So we come to this that starts off with saying in this verse, essentially kind of, obey and submit to these leaders. And that is not a text I have ever brought before us. And I don't think there's a lot of pastors who would be hesitant to ever want to say that because it seems to be kind of self-serving, like, hey, you need to obey, so typically would be avoided. Which leads to the question, well then, why are you putting this before us today? So let me give you 3 quick reasons. Number 1, it's my last day as lead pastor, so I have nothing to lose. And I'm kidding, sort of. But secondly, it's because as we come, and I realize to next Saturday, we're doing a lot of things culminating in the installation of Josh. And normally in that kind of an installation, there might be a message about what this is conferring and about the role. And we're not going to have time to do that in the way that might typically be done. So in a way, I just saw how fitting it would be that today I want to bring this as kind of charges to Josh and to the community, that it's a fitting moment. It's kind of basically a part of or preparing for Saturday in that way, something we won't be able to fully do. But lastly, it's because God really brought this verse to me over the last 2 years. And I'd never had focused much on it, but it was stirring to me. It kind of spoke to me in ways. And I realized as we were arriving, this is that word that makes sense and fits today. And it's particularly because of this, that God impressed on me that there's this beautiful sense of mutual responsibility that this verse is bringing forward, because it speaks of the responsibility of the spiritual leader. And whoa, the watcher of souls. But it also helps to clarify that there's a responsibility of response to that role in the people. So there's these 2 things that come together so beautifully here. And now this is a word primarily for the people, for a community to recognize, to hear, to respond to. And we'll come to that. But what I want to do is quickly, first, bring 3 charges to Josh, and in some ways I share this with Brianne as well, and then 3 charges to us as a community. And so I want to say that first, as I speak these things to Josh, it is very clear to me that there is nothing new that I'm saying to Josh. I'm more than aware of that. Josh, for anyone who's not aware, has fully served as a spiritual leader, particularly as a lead pastor for several years. So this is not in any way about saying anything to you, Josh, that you don't know deeply. And the word that I had shared with you before that God's been impressing on me, though, is this is simply, in ways, a reaffirmation, but it is about being set apart afresh into this, being entrusted afresh. And what God really brought to my heart for you two is, it's not being set apart again. It's being set apart afresh. It's not just the same, although it shares the same. There's nothing new. At the core, it's the same. But there's a set apart of freshness in this. And I hope this week that just has a way of just kind of being something God maybe continually lets you enjoy, is the freshness of it. And with that, I want to say, number 1, speak the word of God in word and in deed. This is what is right there in the text as we jump up to verse 7, which said, remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you, consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. And I want to say, Josh, you have shown yourself so faithful to this, so faithful to that word, so faithful in your life. So this is not in any spirit of condescending at all. It's actually just reaffirming. And I say it because the reality is, you and I both know that no matter how committed we are to that, it is never easy. It is never a simple and easy thing to presume to somehow be able to always speak what God spoke into the context of a current situation. And that is what we all gather around, is the reality that the God who spoke speaks. The God who spoke speaks. That is why Scripture has the power to be that which has its own context in God spoke, but it is continually a new conversation, because it's a conversation with new lives, new context. And so it is that which is always a challenging one. And I want to take a moment to quote real quickly something that a friend who's been a member of this community for a long time wrote this week, completely out of this, not a part of this particular context, but just noting and describing so beautifully. He said, from the vantage point of being 92 years old, I have dealt with change in so many different streams of life. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And yet, taking up your crosses and following him is affected by different circumstances, environments, and time frames. Meaning it's always bringing something new into what it means or what it implies. For me, the church to stay tuned and true to the teachings appears to require a nearly divine understanding of both word and audience, a dynamic duo intention. And so it is that we know it is. It is living in that incredible sense that, God, you spoke, but now you're still speaking through this. And you're speaking it into an always new exchange with a new heart, a new life. And so the first charge I make is so simply, speak the word of God in this time and in this place. Always new. Not even Denver 10 years ago. Always new. And secondly, care for the souls entrusted to you. The implication that's right here, the writer is bringing forth is this, that spiritual leaders watch over souls and they are accountable to God. And those are incredible, weighty words, to say the least. The idea that, wow, I bear accountability to the souls of a community of lives. And of course, this is true, and a word for Joel and Ron and Bob and all of the elders. There's a sense of that oversight, and they've embraced that. They take that to heart. But it is certainly a weighty thing to do, to be watching over those souls. And I think it's we need to know that we all do that to a degree. We all have lives that have been entrusted to us. We may not always feel it's exactly clear, but usually our family members, some close friends, we realize they're entrusted because they're now in my sphere of influence. If somebody is deeply in your sphere of influence, there's a sense in which you're entrusted with their life, your influence to them. And in many ways, so we all share that. But here, uniquely, the writer is going out of their way to say, yes, but this is one that is acknowledged as a role set apart for the whole community. This is a role that uniquely is the watching over souls, the well-being of souls. So it shares something of that parent for children, but it can never be as personal. It's not a few lives, and it's not always as connected to those lives. There's kind of fluidity to it. But it carries that same heart. And so that is part of what you carry, Josh. And I think that I just want to bring to you, as I did before, the reality that as every parent knows, we hit that reality that I'm not in control of them. I want to be responsible for them, but I don't have control. I have influence. And the more we let go of control, the more we realize our influence. And that there's grace in that, because I would encourage you again to remember Jesus, who himself comes to one who says, oh, I want to follow. And Jesus speaks to him, and the man says, I can't do that. And he walks away, and it says Jesus was sad. It doesn't say Jesus got up and ran after him and said, you need to do it. He knew that he had influence. Now, had he not been a stranger, maybe Jesus would have continued to engage further, but the point is that he knew that. Or how about the fact that Jesus gives his whole 3 years of his life, his whole ministry, to 12 lives who he lives with 24/7. And in the end, when you think he's like, hey man, I did it, one of them completely betrays him, Judas, as you may recall. And now you might think that at this point, Jesus would be saying, oh my gosh, Judas, you're totally screwing this up, like I had this whole thing, like you're the team. You can't do this now because this is my success. It's about making sure that it all goes right and everybody stays in line. And he doesn't say that. You don't get a sense that Jesus' ego was connected to some idea of outward success. What he says to the Father at the end, right after this happens, is, Father, I've fulfilled what you gave me to do. Clearly, he didn't understand that he had control. He understood he was to care. He understood that it wasn't about the success outwardly as much as the faithfulness to have cared. And so with that, Josh, charge you with that kind of grace to care for souls, but to not carry that in any other way than the way of Jesus. and to know what that bears, as you've known so well. I've seen you do that. I've seen you so deeply care and not, at the same time, not presume that kind of control and be able to continue to walk. And I encourage you in that. And lastly, I would charge you with this: enjoy the joy. Enjoy the joy, because there the writer says, it is better to do this with joy and not with groaning. And it becomes very clear that the writer he's talking about more about how other people can make it a joy or a groaning. But the truth of it is, there is obviously both ways to experience joy and groaning, and we will grow. We will groan, we will feel sadness, we will feel weight. That's part of life for anybody. But it's also part of one trying to lead in any time the things of Jesus in life. We're told Jesus was a man who would be what? Acquainted with sorrow and grief. He was, and we can see Jesus engage and take things and feel sad. But we're also told, in fact, in the biblical book of Hebrews, just before this, it says, but Jesus endured the cross and all the suffering and sadness. Why? By how? By the joy set before him. Like, okay, well, I don't get this. There's sadness and joy. I don't know how to conceive that. But here's what I think we need to grasp, and it's there for you, that there's a stream called joy, and it runs into the waters of life. And it brings something else into what would otherwise maybe be that sadness and those hardships. And so he endured that, not merely, I think, because he saw heaven, because I think he knew that, but I think because he knew that he was beginning to see the kingdom being inaugurated. And he knew that change was now at hand, just as you've known, Josh. When you know that even when things are hard, there is that sense of, but look, God now is at work in lives. God's changing the world. The kingdom wins, if you will. And it's that joy that has to constantly run through us because it lifts us. And I've seen the two of you lift your spirits in worship. And you guys, and you've been calling us to that, Brianne, lifting our spirits to all that God's doing. And I've seen you learn how to play and to laugh. And all of that is vital. It's vital because it's how we come through, where we know the groaning, but we know the joy. And so I want to just say to you too that we need that to be able to carry on. You need it. Jesus needed it. Jesus needed that. He needed the joy to infuse how we're going to make our way through. And so I encourage you to that. And now I want to bring a kind of a charge to us as a community as well. The writer here is clearly speaking of something so significant. They're trying to present, in a sense, a call to recognize that you may not realize it, but this spiritual leader has been entrusted with what? Watching over your soul. And even embracing that they're accountable in a way, in a healthy way, to that. That's profound. And they're bringing that home to realize this. Now, I know that initially it's like, well, that's not what I heard, because the two words obey and submit, or those types of things, they jump out and they become like a wall. Like, I didn't hear that. I heard it tell me to, I'm just supposed to sit down and accept all this, or, just give myself to that. And so it's vital to understand that this is about something more than that. And it's hard because kind of in today's kind of hyper individualism, those first words really strike us, and we're kind of stuck in something that says, no, nobody tells me what to do. And so we just kind of can't hear past it, and for good reason. There is so much broken trust. Like, part of the challenge is the fact that those who have been in positions of spiritual leadership, among others, have misused it and abused it. And so many people find themselves stuck in that and unable to kind of open up to the good. And for other reasons, I think it's because we've lost any sense about what it means to actually be connected and bound with others. And so the writer here, though, is calling us back to realize that such a role is a gift when it's faithful. And I remember first stepping into this role and realizing that as I first stepped into it as a typical kid kind of coming out of that era, what did I just do? I've stepped into a role that in some ways has authority to it, to pastor a generation who what? Is defined by resisting and being against authority. Like, what did I just do? Like, this is not going to be enjoyable, to try to be like why would you want to be in that role? And you may recall, like, the way things get at times, it's kind of like the call, like, well, who will take the charge? Who will go first? Who will go forward as we march towards this goal? And you have a whole bunch of people in line, and a bunch of them step back and leave one poor schmuck at the front. And it's kind of the idea that we know, like, who would want to lead when really that is ultimately kind of hard. And that is going to bring what? Hardship, criticism, all those things. And it's important to grasp that. So I realized that as I was stepping into that role, that in many ways, this is not going to be easy or good because of the feelings of authority. But here's what I discovered, that in reality, we don't just resist authority. We don't just have antagonism towards authority. We actually long for good authority. We long for good leadership, might be the better word. And the truth is, and I just want you to hear this because I think it speaks volumes to kind of what is at the heart of all of these things, is that we long for the Father we've never known. If I could sum up so much, we long for the Father we've never known. I may have had a very good father on earth, but there is something deeper that we long for, that perfect voice of truth and love brought together, or loving truth being brought together. We long for it. And the point is this: when leadership is good, it is presenting and bringing us and connecting us to hear and know and live in that Father's heart. And I want to say that it has been such an incredible privilege to be able to lead a community that has lived in that. And what we celebrate next week is 50 years in which this community has enjoyed imperfectly, but for the most part defined by the Father's love. And that being defining, where he speaks truth and he speaks love. And all of these things come together. And I want to say largely, or part of that is because it's the spirit of the Vineyard movement. And I want you to grasp that, and it's going to be wonderful to have Jay Pathak not only coming and joining us Saturday, he'll be speaking here next Sunday. So I'm so thankful for that, and encourage you to even continue to grasp this tribe, this part of the family that we are a part of. But I want to say it's also because of and why it's been such a gift and such a joy and such a privilege, and I believe good, is because on the west side, God's continued to do that because people have continued to give themselves to that. This week I was meeting Wednesday with pastors around the area, Vineyard pastors, and we quickly started by going around saying, like, what are you grateful for? What's one thing you're grateful for? And I thought to myself, there's a lot of things, but what jumped out to me is this. I've been looking at pictures over the 50 years to put something together, and I kept seeing these faces of people that nobody would remember. They weren't always the people up front, but they gave years of investing and sowing and watering the good stuff of God. And out of that came the fruit of lives that were being changed because they gave themselves. And that is what I mean by the spirit of this church, which has never been a church where there's prima donnas, but rather a family of people who serve, contribute, and discover what can happen when we do. And it's so that is the spirit by which I want to bring these charges. And the reason I say that is this is not so much a challenge as it is a reaffirmation of these qualities, because it is, though, a new season and a very vital season to be reminded of these things. And the first of those, and the first charge I would make to us, is this: follow the lead of the leader. That is the beginning of what is spoken out here. Follow the lead of the leader. He says, have confidence in your leaders and submit to their authority. Now, nearly every other translation says obey and submit. And it's unique that the NIV translation would try to unpack this a little bit differently by saying have confidence in them. But it begins to hint at the fact that this idea of obedience is that which flows from a personal relationship. It flows from the fact that one is extending their confidence where it's due. Oh, that's different than just this kind of positional authority being imposed on me. And that is so important to grasp here, to really be able to receive this call. Because many of us think, oh, this is just positional authority calling me to just kind of blindly give myself to it. That's not the case. The writer of this book had Caesar in the background, but they were not speaking of Caesar. Caesar was a dictator. Caesar was not a leader. He didn't lead anybody. He just imposed this authority on people. So what is the writer speaking of if it's not the Caesar, the emperor of the empire? He's speaking of something more like the rabbi. That is the spiritual leader. The spiritual leader of a rabbi was that in which people looked to them and they would choose and say, I see these qualities. I want to follow I align with what they're saying. I align with their way of life. And I want to be, I'd be privileged if they would be my guide. It is really coming to follow that guide, follow that one who brings these things to bear. And so the writer is speaking of the one who invites you to join them, who will watch over you as those who must give account. And it means being invited into sharing life together in that process. And I want to say something that I've found so true in the last few years, which is that we live in kind of a unique time because we also have lots and lots of sources of information and teaching. It's called the internet. Some of you have heard of it. And you can end up spending lots of time there and being enjoined to many voices, and many bring very valuable insights. There's a lot to gain. I too do that a lot. And so that is in itself a challenge. But I would say this. One of the challenges it does bring is this. People don't realize that they're being pastored by a lot of people. And the truth is, when you listen to these words and what they're saying about spiritual leadership, sharing life, knowing, you need to realize those people on the internet, they don't know you. They take no responsibility for your life. None. It's only in community that can happen. It's only a community where you can say, but you've accepted a different role in my life. And so for some of us, it means like, yeah, that's a good thing. This is a gift. This is a gift to have someone who, and people, because there's other pastors, elders, overseers. This might be a time to come to one of them and say, hey, I just want to share something about my story with you. Like to get known, because that is when the beauty of this begins to happen. And so maybe this is a time to kind of come out of those spaces of individualism, to be known so that you can properly understand what it even means to be able to follow. And I want to share something else that I discovered, and that is about just the dynamics of being up front. It's a challenge as a leader, but most people will perceive it sometimes through that authority issue thing of saying, oh, the guy up front, the person up front, the woman up front, they must have their ego inflated by being there, because that's what we see happen so much. We see this ego inflation. Let me just say, that is entirely true. Like that can absolutely take place. We know that, we feel that. But there's this other thing I discovered that's very much a part of it. After I started to be in this role, I realized every week I'm getting up and feeling naked, meaning I have to bring my imperfect self into this position of daring to believe that somehow God would use that. Like, that's really hard. It's really hard, and it felt almost deflating instead of inflating. There's these two things going on. And I read right around that time that a study had come out that said 70% of pastors report that they find their self-esteem was lower after 2 years in ministry. A lot of people would be surprised. I thought, I'm not surprised at all. Because you need to realize there's also a risk that one brings himself into. So we're always navigating that. And the point I want to make is that part of following a leader is appreciating that that person is putting themselves in that position. But it's vital that anybody does that. It's so, so, so vital to grasp that. And so I appreciate all that it involves, but it is a call to follow that leading and to realize this is not some kind of positional thing. This is a deeply spiritual thing. The authority is ultimately always God, but as somebody is helping to make that manifest for us. Number 2, and this leads to it, and that is be a blessing, not a burden. Be a blessing, not a burden. He says, follow the leader in such a way as what? That their work will be a joy, not a burden, for that would be of no benefit to you. And let me just say, it's really important to grasp that he's not laying a trip on people when he says that. The writer is not saying, you need to submit every personal choice in your life to this person. That would have been the furthest thing from their mind. It is nothing of that. What it is a recognition of, though, is that if we're going to have a communal life, if we're going to enjoy the power of what Jesus began working itself out on the earth, it's going to take place through people who gather and become that body together. And that communal life needs communal support. And let me say this. I hope this is something you can kind of take to heart, and that is leading communal life in a consumer world is hard. Leading communal life in a consumer world is hard because what the church once was is now turned in, for many of us, like we do the rest of life, where we just kind of sit and look to be the recipients of religious goods or spiritual inspiration. And we kind of see it as, what do I gain from that? And it makes it very hard to build a communal life. At some level, there is no way that we can be what we're meant to be, what Jesus called us to be, unless we can learn how to realize, yes, I have my own personal spiritual choices, my own personal spiritual formation to deal with, absolutely. But at some level, there is a collective. At some level, there is a collective joining in which there is a we. And until, for some of us, that we realize I may need to confront my kind of incredible independence, we'll never be able to serve the collective. There has to be a we. And a lot of times we struggle because we think, well, I don't feel very connected. I get that. A lot of us don't feel as connected to other people as we'd want, but we have to confront our own independence. We have to realize part of that can be in us. And we need to confront the we, confront the I to some degree, so we realize maybe I need to kind of be more open and be a part of those things. And my hope for you and I is that you will realize that there is so much communally that is going to unfold that it needs you. And my heart is you be all in. See, we as a leadership team, we have gathered around Josh's vision, and we find ourselves saying, man, we're in. Like we really can give that. We can give our support. And my hope for you is that you'll find yourself, and as you go through this next season, of saying, you know what? I can support this. You know, it doesn't matter. It's not about all the details, but this is good. Let's go and be all in. Be all in. At some point, we come to that place when we are truly all in which we can bring ourselves to be those who are able to support of that. Because the power of mission and Jesus knew this, is when there's that confluence of lives that say, you know what, I'm bringing my thing. The truth is, and you hope you'll grasp this, it's always about everyone bringing their gifts. Jesus said, you're going to become my body. You will embody me as you all bring, as the Apostle Paul said, your part. You might be a foot, a hand, whatever it might be, but we all bring something. You make a difference. So the question isn't whether you make a difference, the question is whether you're going to bring yourself and bring your difference. Really bring and contribute your difference. And that's not a trip, that's not a saying you have to discern that overnight, but it is saying that is what the writer has in mind. How do you bring your difference into that? And let me say, too, that the writer is not implying at all when he speaks of not being a burden, of not sharing your burdens. That is not what he's implying whatsoever. Many people will say, oh, Pastor, I don't want to be a burden, and then they just want to share what they're going through. I'm like, that isn't a burden, that is a blessing. Like, it's really a blessing to share lives, share the challenges, share the struggles. And let me just say, like, not only is it a blessing when you and I can share those things together and we can engage them, but even if one is struggling to understand, I don't know how I feel about this or that, and this might sound critical, sharing it is never a burden. What I want to share with you is that sometimes not sharing it is a burden. I mean, this is a highly relational dynamic that we live in. You know, it's about a lot of lives being involved with them, and it's such a gift. But what can be hard in that is that for sometimes when people feel like, well, I'm uncertain about like where I'm at with this or that they might feel, well, I don't want to be critical, so I won't say anything. And what one as a pastor can experience is what I would call the silent withdrawal. And what is experienced in that silent withdrawal is ultimately that I guess this relationship wasn't valuable enough to come and engage, and it feels sad. It feels like one can never know where they're at with somebody else and where somebody else is at in their life and their participation in the community. So I want to encourage you with that. It is always hard if we don't communicate. It is always a blessing when we do. And so I want to encourage you, find that commitment to say, you know what, I'm going to go through this season making sure that I am not a burden, which means like hurtful, that I want to say this relationship matters, and I want to communicate my challenges or whatever else is going on, whether it's sitting down with, Josh or elders, I want to encourage you to step out towards that. And I want to say, lastly, that where he begins to land is this. He's calling us to say that be a community who is facing forward. Like, turn ourselves to what is. Always giving ourselves to this reality. If you want to know what should I be thinking at this stage, just remember, everything God has for you is what is now to come. It's ahead of you. Where is God? We always want to know. Where is God? What's he doing? I don't know entirely. What I do know is whatever he's doing, it's ahead of you. It's not behind you. And how do we face forward? I know no better way than to pray. Praying is what invites me to face forward. It turns my spirit towards that. It opens me up to what God is saying I should be seeking. So it shouldn't be surprising that after verse 17, which we just read, what are the next three words that follow in verse 18? Pray for us. And I leave this last charge to us as a community. Pray for Josh and Brianne and all those entrusted as spiritual leaders. Pray for all this transition. As Josh said, anticipate, begin to ask God all of what you might have. But how, God, we want all that you have. And we want to pray for that and bless. If you want leaders who will lead you into the future, then pray. Pray for that leading into the future. Pray for the whole of that process, because we value what's forward. So I think it's a wonderful time and a wonderful way for us to conclude today by doing something we used to do here and there but haven't done for quite a while, and that's this, that I'm going to invite us a minute to pray by breaking up into groups, meaning just turning to some people sitting in front or behind you, however it works out, but of just groups of just 3 to 5 people. Just 3 to 5. If there's more than 5, split it into 2 groups so that everybody has an opportunity to pray. Now, you may not be comfortable praying aloud. Either stretch yourself or just in your heart affirm what others are praying. But my hope is that everyone will find a way to begin to come and join together and saying, God, we want this blessing here. We want to seek this. We want to declare God's, authority against all the things that might come against it. We just say, bless this transition. Bless this transition. Can you do that with me? Yes. Then I'm going to ask you, and I know it's a little awkward, a little different, but trust me in this. It's good. I'm going to ask you to just turn, and I'll close this time of prayer, and we'll stand and we'll worship together. But for now, would you just join with 3 to 5 people around you. Introduce yourself if you haven't met before. You can introduce yourself quickly, but then begin to join in prayer.